Hello knitting friends, and we know who you are. You've got a box or a drawer, or dare I say a closet full of all these tiny little balls of scrap yarn that you can't bear to throw away. Well, don't throw them away because you can make this beautiful scarf all with your little balls of scrap yarn. It's easy to make, knits up really fast. You can design it as you go. It makes a beautiful addition to your fall wardrobe. So let's gather all your scrap yarn together and let's get started. So let's take a look at how to knit this very fun, unique scarf using up all of your scrap yarn. And I want to thank Tess from tessknits.com for allowing us to use her pattern for this demonstration. Tess also has some really fun, unique, one-of-a-kind skeins of yarns that she produces and sells from upscale scraps of very fancy, wonderful yarn. So she creates these one-of-a-kind skeins that she sells. So I encourage you to check out her link in my description below for that yarn and also her pattern. So thank you, Tess, for that. So let's take a look at the construction of this scarf. We are going to be producing a very wide, long scarf that is starts here at the very end and then ends with a lot of stitches on your needle. So we're going to start at the very tip of the scarf. We're going to cast on only 3 stitches to begin with, and then at the beginning and end of each row we are going to do an increase stitch, a knit in front and back. So that is going to produce 2 increases for every row. So your 3 stitches will soon become 5, then 7, then 9, 11, etc. So you are very quickly adding stitches to your needle to produce this very wide scarf, which makes for a really perfect shape for a nice scarf or shawl. You'll notice too that I am just knitting every row. So this is a basic garter stitch, so no other fancy stitches other than the knit stitch and then the increase stitches, the knit in front and back, which we will show in the video in just a moment. Also, if you look closely, you'll see that I used multiple strands of yarn for each row of knitting. So I've taken my scraps of yarn and combined 2 or 3 strands of yarn together to make a very thick strand of yarn that I'm knitting. So it's basically knitting with a very, very bulky weight yarn. So let's take a look at the scraps of yarn that I've chosen to do for this scarf. I went through my closet and this is only just a portion of it, right? But I picked out several different fun colors that I could use for this scarf. So I've got some grays, some reds, some yellows, and I think that will just make a very pretty combination. So you can choose whatever color combination you would like for your scarf with whatever yarn that you have available. You'll notice too that I've got several different weights of yarn in my collection here. I've got some very bulky weight yarn, a lot of worsted weight yarn, and even some fingering weight yarn. And that's because I can make a combination of yarns together to produce that single strand. I can do 2 or 3 strands of worsted weight together, or maybe a bulky weight with a fingering weight together, whatever combination to get me that very bulky yarn strand. Now don't worry if some of your rows are a little bit bulkier than others. That's okay. That's just going to add to the uniqueness and texture of your scarf to have some rows that are a little bit thicker and some a little bit lighter weight. So no problem there. So here's my collection of yarn. Now let's take a look at how we can start with doing these stitches. So I've started a few rows here just to give us a good start on the scarf. As I mentioned, I started with casting on 3 stitches, and actually my first row I just knitted those stitches to give us a little foundation. And then I started the increase rows where I knitted it in the front and back in the first stitch and the very last stitch of each row, and I will show you that as I continue to knit here. And then what I did with each color combination of strands, I knitted them for 3 rows each. When I knitted these for 3 rows, I switched to this red and white strand. So you'll see that the start of my knitting tail yarn is on one side, and when I knitted 3, I knitted 1, 2, 3, and then ended with my tail of that color combination on the other side. And that allows me to have tails on both sides of my scarf, so I can then use them as the tassels of my scarf, because that's going to eliminate a huge problem of weaving in all these ends if you don't use tassels. So that makes it a great way to just use the tails of each of your segments of colors and incorporate them into tassels. So let's continue here. My last little color combination I did with this tan and gray, just 2 strands of worsted weight. So now I'm ready to think of what color strand I want to use for my next couple rows. So we're done with these 2 yarns. So I'll set those aside, and now maybe let's incorporate, maybe this yellow and off-white together. I think that will be a good next color combination. But this is where the fun comes. You know, you can just design this as you go. In each couple rows, you can kind of say, what color works well next, and see where it takes you. So let's start with these next 2 colors. And I did snip off the tails of my last 2 colors, so now I'm going to get ready to just begin knitting with these 2 strands. I'm going to just hold them together. I like to wrap them around my pinky to give it a little stability. You want to make sure you give yourself a nice decent tail, so you have enough tail for the tassels at the end, and make sure that they're long enough so you can determine later how long you want your tassels, and you have enough yarn for that. Now you'll notice I'm using a very thick needle as well, because I'm putting several strands or multiple strands together. It, like I mentioned, becomes a very thick weight yarn, so you want a very thick needle. I'm using a US size 15, and I'm using a very long circular needle because eventually, it doesn't look like it now, I only have a few stitches on here, but eventually I'm going to have many stitches on my needle. So let's get these stitches to one side here, and I'm going to begin now knitting with my next 2 colors. Okay, now my very first stitch for every single row is going to be a knit in the front and the back. So I'm going to take this first stitch, knit it regularly with the going through the front loop, and then before I take it off my needle, I'm going to knit it in the back loop as well, and make sure I'm picking up both strands of yarn. Here, I lost my other, there we go, there's a strand, 2 strands, and knit through the back loop. Now you'll notice that this very first stitch is very loosey-goosey because that strand I cut off, so there's nothing really anchoring that down, but don't worry, we're going to tighten that up in just a little bit. So I knitted in the front and back for my first increase, and then I'm just going to knit to the end of this row. And again, you'll see what happened obviously earlier. I dropped one of those strands. You want to make sure when you're knitting with multiple strands of yarn that you are picking up both of those strands, and both of those strands are coming through on your knit stitch, so you don't, accidentally drop one of those strands. So we'll knit with these color combination to the end. And then when we get to the end of the row, the very last stitch, we are also going to knit in the front and the back. So don't forget, the first stitch, the last stitch, knit in the front and the back to do that increase. Now that's going to give us our triangular shape. So knit in the front and the back for that increase. Okay, so now remember when I said we would tighten up that loosey-goosey stitch at the start? You can do that any time, but I like after I finish that first row, take my tail from my new strands and my tail from the previous few rows and just give it a little tie. We're going to be tying those together anyway for the fringe at the end, so you might as well just give it a little tie now just to tighten up that stitch just a little bit, so when you come back to that last stitch it's not so loose. So let's flip it around, and we're going to knit row 2 in this very same fashion with this same color strand. So again, we'll start with a knit in the front and the back. That's the first stitch of every row, and knit to the end of this row again. And again, when we approach the end of this row, we get to that last stitch. Still a little loosey-goosey there, but we're going to knit in the front and the back of this stitch as well. Continue to kind of pull that tight so it stays a little snug. Now we'll do our final row of this color before we switch to another color combination. Okay, now at the end of my third row, the knit in front and back, don't forget to do that. And now we have completed that color segment for 3 rows. 1, 2, 3. We've got the tail at one end and we're going to finish the tail at the other end. So I can snip off a good long section, make sure I have enough for my fringe, snip that off, and now I'm ready to think about what color combination I want to do next. So I can take a look at my colors here and think, maybe I want to go back to maybe a light gray and maybe combine that with this rust color. Maybe that would be a fun color combination to do next. So once I've cut off the old strands, can set those aside, and now we've got 2 more colors to do, and we will just repeat that every 3 rows, just adding new colors. And I will just start knitting with my new 2 colors, knit in the front and the back. And so that's kind of just the pattern that you're going to just keep repeating. Of course, your scarf is going to get longer and longer, so it's going to take longer to do each color strand. But it's just a fun way to kind of design it as you go. Think about what color combinations you want. Now, I will show you a little bit how to just wrap this scarf up at the end with the fringe. So let's finish this row and then I'll kind of show you how to do that fringe part. All right, I actually completed a couple more rows with some new color combinations just to kind of show you how some of these other groupings of a really bulky weight with a fingering weight yarn looks together. So you can continue in this fashion, keep choosing your fun colors, 3 rows each, and of course your scarf is going to be getting longer and longer, and continue that until it measures from this peak here to the top center about 15 inches. So this, I've got about 10 more inches to go of the scarf, and that gives it a fairly good size to wrap it around your neck twice for a good scarf. So when you're done and you've got it to the measurement that you like, just bind off your last row of stitches like you normally would. And then to just secure and finish off the fringe for your scarf, what you want to do is you've already made that one tie probably while you're knitting to tighten up those loose stitches. So just do another little tie. So you've got a double knot there for each of your fringe. And then just measure how long you want your fringe to be. If you want a short fringe, a couple inches or 4 inches, whatever you want it to be. Let's say we want it to be 4-inch fringe. Just measure it and trim it off, and do that for each of your little fringes. Now, if you wanted to add more fringe, you could take some additional yarn, make some strips of that yarn and secure it in between these 2 fringe spots. It's up to you just how much fringe you're happy with. So that's how to do this fun scrap scarf. It makes for a beautiful scarf. I always get compliments on this when I wear this. It's absolutely beautiful, and best part, it uses up all your scrap yarn. So I hope you found this helpful. If so, please give me a like and don't forget to subscribe to receive notifications of new videos all about knitting tips and stitches and creative patterns like this one. Thanks for watching. Happy knitting, everyone.